Don't you dare use our bathroom.
I had become like a servant to my mother-in-law, Linda. Yes, ma'am.
What? I can't hear you. Anyway, how long are you sitting there? It's disgusting to think of you touching anything in the house. You'll contaminate everything. Even the air feels dirtier. From now on, use the bathroom and shower out of the house. That's more than enough for you.
But there's nowhere open at this time to take a shower.
What are you talking about? There's a park right over there, isn't there? It has a bathroom and a faucet, doesn't it? If you are not going, you cannot be in this house.
With that, Linda locked me out of the house. I started walking towards the park. Let's take this story back in time a bit. After marrying my husband, Daniel, we started living with his parents since we both worked. Before getting married, I would occasionally visit Daniel's family home. Each time, his father, George, was kind to me, treating me like his own daughter. Having lost my father when I was young, George felt like a real father to me. However, just before our marriage, George fell ill, and by the time we moved in, he was hospitalized. On the other hand, Linda was cold towards me, in stark contrast to George. In front of George, Linda was all smiles and never bothered me. But once he was gone, she'd say things like, "Your cooking is too salty. Are you trying to make me sick?" Or, "The air feels polluted whenever you're near." Living with Linda, who was a stay-at-home mom and always at home, became my most challenging time. I didn't want to go home, so I ended up working more than usual. The more I worked overtime, the more sarcastic remarks I received from Linda. Eventually, every time Linda saw me, she would nag and sigh dramatically. One day, when I returned from work, as usual, Linda frowned upon me and said, "Don't walk around the house with your filthy body. You'll make it dirty." I was hungry and wanted to eat dinner first, but reluctantly, I headed to the bathroom. However, Linda, standing in front of the bathroom, looked at me with disgust.
You're not thinking of using our bath, are you?
But I thought I should clean off the dirt.
Go clean up outside. How dare you think of using our bath?
Outside. But nothing nearby is open at this time.
If you go far enough, you'll find somewhere that's open. You should figure that out yourself. After all, I'm a germaphobe. I can't stand having someone else in the house, let alone someone as unsanitary as you.
What should I do then?
You staying in the house would contaminate everything. Technically, a daughter-in-law isn't even family, so you should take care of your baths and bathroom needs outside.
How can I even?
Enough. There's a bathroom in the park, isn't there? And they have water faucets for a bath. Stop dawdling and get out.
Linda pushed me out and locked the door. Stunned, I stared at the closed door. Being nagged like this was a daily occurrence, but this was the first time she locked me out. I thought I would be allowed to use the bath by tomorrow, so I spent the night at an internet cafe a few stations away. But my hope was too optimistic. Days passed, and I was still not allowed to use the bath or the toilet. I resorted to using the public bath with my own money and the park's restroom. But Linda wasn't satisfied. She even went as far as to say, "Since I'm letting you live here, it's only right you give me your earnings for rent. How despicable to think you can stay for free." The money was supposed to help my mother living alone in the countryside, but I couldn't refuse Linda's intense demand and gave her my salary. Daniel saw how I was treated but always put his mother first. Even on cold days when I had to use the restroom outside, he ignored me. Sometimes, he even laughed at me with Linda. Half a year into living with them, how they treated me didn't improve. It got worse day by day. Why do I have to endure such treatment? I've thought about this time and time again. But Daniel always sides with Linda, and George is in the hospital. I didn't want to make my mother worry, who had been sick from stress before. There was no one around I could rely on. So, I ended up having to bear the unjust treatment every day without being able to talk to anyone about it. Staying at home meant enduring endless nagging, making it unbearable. But since all the money I earned went to Linda, and obviously, Daniel didn't give me any allowance, I couldn't even afford to spend time outside. Additionally, since Linda didn't do any housework, it fell on me, and coming home late meant getting nagged at by Linda, so I couldn't stay out either. Unable to buy new clothes or go to the salon, my days were spent becoming racked, both physically and mentally. Sometimes, the little joy I had was heading to the public bath with the small amount of money I had left after work. But Linda's complaints if I skimped on housework and financial issues meant I couldn't afford to go to the bath daily, and I started developing itches and other discomforts on my skin. One day, as I was heading to the park's restroom as usual, I saw George. Then it hit me. Today was the day he had gotten permission for an overnight stay outside the hospital since he was recovering. I had planned to pick him up later, but it seemed he had managed to come back on his own. George, with his ever-kind smile, greeted me as if nothing had changed.
Naomi, what are you doing out here?
Just going to the restroom.
The restroom. We have one at home, don't we? Is it broken?
No, it's not that.
Is something wrong?
I knew talking about how I'm being treated at home would surely worry George, my kind father-in-law. I didn't want to cause him any concern. But, unable to hold back any longer, I ended up telling him everything. I've been told I'm not a member of the family, so I'm not allowed to use the bathroom or the bath at home.
What?
Linda is a germaphobe. She can't stand the idea of me, an outsider, using the bathroom or the bath.
And Daniel hasn't said anything about this.
Daniel gets along well with Linda, so he hasn't really done anything.
I see.
After a heavy sigh, George apologized and said, "Let's go home together. I'm sorry for everything that's happened." Hearing George's words, I felt the tension that had been gripping me start to ease. Barely holding back the tears that threatened to spill, I quickly finished up in the restroom and then returned home with George. Once home, George gathered Linda and Daniel in the living room. Initially, Linda was happy about George's return but became puzzled by his unusual demeanor.
I've heard about everything from Naomi.
What do you mean, everything?
Don't play dumb. You've been telling Naomi she's not a member of the family, so she can't use the bathroom or the shower.
That's because...
And on top of that, you've been taking all of Naomi's salary.
Why would you?
Linda glared at me, but George stepped in between us, shielding me from her.
That is very wrong, Linda. You should reflect on how you've treated Naomi. Yes, she's an outsider, but she came here to be with Daniel, trying to become a part of our family. Instead of appreciating her, you've treated her terribly.
Linda went quiet.
We were all strangers before we became a family. We can become a family without caring for each other as strangers. But what have you been doing, Linda and Daniel?
Huh?
Daniel flinched when his name was called.
You're Naomi's husband. You're protecting the wrong person. Instead of always defending your mother, you need to protect your wife properly. That's a husband's duty.
But
No buts. Daniel, you're an adult. It's time for you to grow up and stand on your own.
Daniel glanced at Linda, apparently spooked by the calm yet unmistakably angry demeanor of George.
it's not like we were intentionally neglecting Naomi, right, Mom?
In response to Daniel's almost pleading words, Linda briefly looked at him before quickly turning back to George.
No, it was Daniel who said if Naomi didn't use the bathroom or the bath at home, we could save on the water bill, and that her salary is ours to take in full. I said it was too cruel, but Daniel insisted.
What, Mom? What are you talking about?
I didn't want to, but I only did it because you told me to.
Don't make things up. It was you who started it, saying you couldn't stand Naomi using the utilities, and you were the one who suggested that if we could freely use Naomi's salary, we could live more lavishly.
Oh, how dare you start accusing your own mother like that?
Linda and Daniel began to blame each other. I could only watch, speechless and unable to keep up with the unfolding scene. The two of them, arguing that neither was at fault, looked nothing like their once harmonious selves, appearing utterly disgraceful. George sighed deeply beside me.
Enough. I've heard enough from both of you. Neither of you has even apologized to Naomi, just arguing about who's not to blame. Learn a bit of shame. Both of you, get out of the house right now and cool off.
George commanded, quickly driving Linda and Daniel out of the house. After that, despite several interactions with Linda and Daniel, far from showing any remorse, they only expressed complaints and grievances about being expelled from the house towards me and George. Both George and I, thoroughly disappointed by Linda and Daniel, decided it was best to divorce and sever the ties. When the divorce was settled, George called me in for a talk and apologized deeply.
It's my fault Linda became so self-centered, and Daniel started living his life centered around his mother, all because I prioritized my career over family life. I might have lectured them about family values, but I wasn't a model husband or father. I had hoped Daniel would learn from my mistakes and build a better home with Naomi.
George.
How selfish of me, Naomi. I'm truly sorry. Ultimately, it's my fault. And as an apology, though it may not be much, I want to leave this house to you.
Please, George, it's not your fault. And this house, it's filled with your memories, isn't it? I couldn't possibly accept it.
But I want to make it up to you somehow. You've been put through so much because of us.
Could we still have dinner together from time to time?
Dinner? Is that really okay with you?
Yes. I lost my father when I was young, so I've always thought of you as my real father. That's why I want to keep being close. George nodded to my words with a look of troubled joy on his face. Afterwards, I moved to an apartment and began living on my own. George, having recovered, seemed to resume life at home, and we often enjoyed meals together, sharing our lives. During these meals, George expressed a wish to meet my mother. Thinking back, my mother had only met George at the wedding, and they hadn't seen each other since then. Despite my divorce from Daniel, if I was going to continue my relationship with George, having a meal together seemed like a good idea. So, about 3 months after the divorce, my mother, George, and I had dinner together. Surprisingly, my mother and George got along well, and the dinner ended on a cheerful note. Before the wedding, a meeting between the two families hadn't been possible due to George's health and my mother's schedule, and at the wedding, they barely exchanged greetings. So, they hadn't really had much of a conversation before, but my mother and George were close in age and shared similar interests, which led to lively discussions. Before I knew it, they started meeting without me. Their relationship deepened quickly, and now George has truly become like a father to me. I still remember how a bit embarrassed they looked when they first told me that they are thinking of getting married. At that moment, I was so surprised, touched, and happy that I couldn't help but cry. My mother moved from the countryside, and after I gave up my apartment, we started living together as a family of 3 in that house. As for Daniel and Linda, from what George has told me, they're somehow managing. Daniel seems to be working hard to support Linda, but their relationship seems to deteriorate day by day, worsened by Linda's selfishness and constant complaints. It seems all of Linda's grievances towards me have turned towards Daniel. Lately, due to the stress of working overtime and living with Linda, Daniel lost his will to work and quit his job without consulting Linda. Linda was furious, but realizing that someone had to work for them to live, she reluctantly started working. However, having been a housewife with little understanding of the outside world, Linda struggled to find a suitable job, quickly leaving any position she did find. Even now, George tells me he sometimes gets calls from Daniel and Linda asking for help, but he has refused them all.
Linda and Daniel may have been family once, but now, the family I must prioritize is the one we have here.
He gently told my mother and me. Besides, George continued,
If there's anything I can teach them now, it's perhaps the value of enduring hardships to understand the pain of others. Maybe if they become a little kinder, someone will come forward to help them.
George shared this thought with a hint of sadness. I believe there will be many challenges ahead, but I want to never forget to be kind to others and cultivate a heart that considers others. I aim to build a gentle, peaceful, and wonderful family myself, just like the one I have with my mother and George.